Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Steve Murray had built his life like he'd built everything else, methodically, deliberately, and with an unforgiving attention to detail. At 42, he stood 6 feet tall, with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness during his 12 years as a military contractor in conflict zones. Those eyes missed nothing, a trait that had kept him alive in places where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. His wife, Christy Murray, had once found that intensity attractive. They'd met 15 years ago when she was a young nurse at Walter Reed Medical Center, treating wounded soldiers returning from overseas. Steve had been recovering from shrapnel wounds, and Christy's gentle touch and warm smile had been a beacon of hope in his darkest moments. She was beautiful then, honey blonde hair, emerald eyes, and a laugh that could light up a room. But beauty, Steve had learned, was often just a mask for rottenness beneath. Their son, Johnny Murray, was 8 years old and possessed an unsettling intelligence that sometimes made Steve wonder if the boy saw too much. Johnny had inherited his father's sharp eyes and his mother's quick wit, creating a combination that often left adults uncomfortable. The kid noticed everything: the way people looked at each other, the subtle changes in voice tone, the lies adults told thinking children wouldn't understand. Christy's mother, Martha Singleton, had lived with him for the past 3 years after suffering a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. The woman had never liked Steve, viewing him as too hard, too unforgiving for her precious daughter. She'd made no secret of her belief that Christy had married beneath herself, that she deserved someone more refined, more cultured than a man who'd made his living in war zones. Steve had tolerated Martha's presence for Christy's sake, converting the ground floor study into a bedroom and hiring a part-time caregiver, Merle Underwood, to help during the day. Merle was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen enough family drama to fill several lifetimes. She had a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, traits that made her excellent at her job, but sometimes uncomfortable to be around. The Murray household appeared picture-perfect from the outside. Their colonial-style home in the affluent suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, boasted manicured lawns and the kind of neighbors who minded their own business. Steve's security consulting firm provided them with a comfortable lifestyle, not wealthy, but secure. Christy worked part-time at a local clinic, claiming she wanted to maintain her nursing skills while caring for her mother. But perfection, Steve knew, was often an illusion maintained by those with the most to hide. The first crack in that illusion had appeared 6 months ago, though Steve hadn't recognized it at the time. Christy had started working longer hours, claiming the clinic was short-staffed. She'd begun paying more attention to her appearance. New clothes, expensive perfume, trips to the salon that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. When Steve had commented on it, she'd laughed it off, saying she needed to feel good about herself while dealing with her mother's condition. Johnny had been the first to notice the changes in his mother's behavior. Children, Steve reflected, were often the best lie detectors. They hadn't yet learned to ignore their instincts in favor of social politeness. Johnny had started asking why Mommy smiled differently now, why she laughed at things that weren't funny, why she always seemed to be looking at her phone. Steve's own military-honed instincts had been dulled by 15 years of domestic life, but they weren't dead. When Christy started receiving calls that made her step outside to talk, when she began taking her phone to the bathroom, when she started volunteering for weekend shifts that somehow never appeared on her official schedule, the old paranoia began to surface. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years in places where everyone was potentially an enemy, where survival depended on reading people's true intentions. He'd come home to what should have been safety, only to discover that the enemy might be sleeping in his own bed. But Steve Murray was not a man who acted on suspicion alone. He was methodical, patient, and thorough. If Christy was betraying him, he would know for certain before he acted. And when he did act, it would be with the same calculated precision that had made him legendary among his former colleagues. He began watching, waiting, and planning. Because Steve Murray had learned long ago that in any conflict, the side that struck first and struck hardest was usually the side that walked away. Chapter 2. Shadows and Whispers. The revelation came in pieces, like a puzzle Steve was reluctant to complete. It started with small inconsistencies. Christy claiming to work late shifts that didn't exist, expensive gifts she claimed came from grateful patients, and a new lightness in her step that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with secrets. Perry Fisher entered their lives like a cancer disguised as medicine. At 38, Perry was everything Steve wasn't. Smooth where Steve was rough, charming where Steve was direct, and possessed of the kind of easy smile that made people forget to ask hard questions. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd started visiting Christie's clinic 6 months ago, always impeccably dressed in designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Perry had a reputation that preceded him. Divorced twice, with a history of relationships that ended when the women discovered his true nature. Selfish, manipulative, and utterly without conscience. He collected married women like trophies, seeming to take particular pleasure in destroying stable families. Christy, with her combination of beauty and vulnerability, had proven irresistible. The first time Steve met Perry was at a hospital charity event Christy had insisted they attend. Perry had approached their table with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies, extending a manicured hand and flashing that practiced smile. "You must be Steve," Perry had said, his grip deliberately firm as if trying to prove something. "Christy talks about you all the time." Steve's handshake had been brief but crushing, his eyes never leaving Perry's face. In that moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of a challenge issued and accepted. Perry's smile had faltered slightly, and Steve had seen something flicker in the man's eyes. Fear, maybe, or the sudden understanding that he was playing a dangerous game. But Perry Fisher was a man who confused charm with intelligence, charisma with cunning. He'd continued his pursuit of Christy, mistaking Steve's initial restraint for weakness. Johnny had been the one to unknowingly provide the confirmation Steve needed. Children, with their brutal honesty, often revealed truths that adults worked hard to hide. "Daddy," Johnny had said one evening while they watched television together, "why does Mommy smell like that man from the hospital?" Steve's blood had gone cold. "What man, son?" "The one with the shiny shoes and the fake smile. He smells like expensive soap and lies." Out of the mouths of babes, Steve had thought. Even an 8-year-old could see what Perry Fisher really was. The surveillance began the next day. Steve's years in the field had taught him patience and attention to detail. He hired a private investigator, Sam Davidson, a former military police officer who owed Steve his life from their time in Afghanistan. Sam was discreet, thorough, and understood the importance of documentation that would hold up under scrutiny. The evidence accumulated like drops of poison in a cup. Photos of Christy and Perry entering hotels during her supposed work hours. Credit card records showing purchases of jewelry and lingerie that never made it home. Text messages recovered from Christy's phone backups that detailed their affair in graphic, nauseating detail. But the most damning evidence was something far more insidious. Perry Fisher, it turned out, had been using his relationship with Christy to gain access to patient information, selling medical data to insurance companies for premium adjustments. He'd turned Christy into an unwitting accomplice, convincing her to provide him with files under the guise of helping patients with their medication costs. Steve had found Christy's laptop one evening, left carelessly open on the kitchen table. The email trail was there for anyone to see. Confidential patient information being forwarded to Perry's personal account, pharmaceutical company kickbacks being deposited into a joint account Christy didn't know Steve had discovered. The betrayal was complete. Not only had Christy violated their marriage vows, but she'd also compromised her professional ethics and potentially destroyed the lives of countless patients whose private medical information had been sold to the highest bidder. Martha Singleton, Steve realized, had known about the affair from the beginning. The old woman's increasing hostility toward him, her pointed comments about Christy deserving better, her knowing smiles when Perry's name was mentioned, it all made sense now. She'd been encouraging her daughter's infidelity, perhaps seeing it as a way to finally drive Steve from their lives. But Steve Murray was not a man who simply walked away. He was a man who understood that betrayal had consequences, that actions demanded accountability. The question wasn't whether he would respond to this betrayal. It was how completely he would destroy those who had dared to cross him. As he sat in his study that night, reviewing the evidence Sam had provided, Steve began a plan. Not just for divorce, not just for separation, but for something far more comprehensive. Christy and Perry had made the mistake of underestimating him, of believing that 15 years of marriage had made him soft. They were about to learn otherwise. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The truth hit Steve like a sledgehammer on a quiet Tuesday evening when he returned home earlier than expected from a canceled business meeting. His key turned silently in the lock, a skill learned in places where noise could mean death, and he stepped into his own home like a stranger entering enemy territory. The sound from upstairs left no room for doubt or denial. Christy's voice, breathless with passion she'd never shown him, mixed with Perry's arrogant laughter. They were in his bed, in his home, while his son played video games in a basement and his mother-in-law pretended to watch television in her ground-floor bedroom. Steve stood frozen in his own foyer, 15 years of marriage crashing down around him like a demolished building. The rage that filled him was pure and clean, the kind of fury that had once made him legendary among his unit. But he'd learned control over the years, learned to channel that rage into something useful, something surgical. He backed out of the house as silently as he'd entered, sitting in his car for 20 minutes until his hands stopped shaking. When he returned, he entered through the front door normally, calling out Christy's name as if nothing had happened. She appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, her hair hastily arranged, her cheeks flushed. "You're home early," she said, and Steve marveled at how easily the lie came to her lips. "Meeting was canceled," he replied, studying her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. There was none. If anything, she seemed annoyed by his unexpected return. That night, as Christy slept peacefully beside him, Steve lay awake staring at the ceiling and planning. The woman next to him had shared his bed for 15 years, had borne his child, had sworn before God and witnesses to honor and cherish him. Now she was nothing more than an enemy in his midst, more dangerous than any insurgent he'd ever faced because she had access to everything he cared about. The next morning, Steve made a phone call to Alan Fisher, his attorney and one of the few men he trusted completely. Alan was a shark in an expensive suit, a man who understood that sometimes the law was a weapon to be wielded rather than a shield to hide behind. "I need to see you," Steve said simply. Today, Alan's office was a monument to his success. Floor-to-ceiling law books, awards, and photographs with politicians and celebrities. But the man himself was unpretentious, direct, and ruthless when necessary. "What can I do for you, Steve?" Alan asked, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. Steve laid out the evidence systematically, the photos, the financial records, the communication logs. Alan listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is comprehensive," Alan said finally. "More than enough for divorce proceedings. We can take her for everything: adultery, breach of trust, potentially criminal conspiracy if we can prove she knew about the medical data sales." "That's not enough," Steve said quietly. Alan raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about justice. Real justice. The kind that makes examples of people who think they can destroy lives without consequences." "Steve," Alan said carefully, "you need to be very careful here. I know what you're capable of, what you've done overseas. But this is America, and these are civilians." Steve's smile was cold as winter steel. "Perry Fisher forfeited his civilian status the moment he entered my house. And Christy," he paused, something dark and final settling in his eyes. "Christy made her choice." That afternoon, Steve placed another call, this one to Ian Hansen, a man who existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, between justice and revenge. Ian ran a security company that specialized in problem-solving for clients who couldn't or wouldn't involve traditional law enforcement. "I need a consultation," Steve said when Ian answered. "Personal or professional?" Both. Ian's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place that legitimate businesses used as fronts for less legitimate activities. Ian himself was unremarkable. Average height, brown hair, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. It was a useful trait in his line of work. "What's the situation?" Ian asked after Steve had outlined the basics. "Total destruction," Steve replied. "I want them to lose everything. Reputation, livelihood, relationships, self-respect. I want them to understand that crossing Steve Murray comes with consequences that last a lifetime." Ian nodded slowly. "That kind of operation requires precision. It's not cheap, and there's no going back once we start. Money isn't an issue, and I've never believed in going back." As Steve drove home that evening, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The die was cast, the plans were in motion. Christy and Perry had made their choices, and now they would live with the consequences. But first, he had to protect the one innocent party in this mess, his son Johnny. The boy would need to be prepared for what was coming, would need to understand that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to protect themselves and those they loved. Because Steve Murray was about to wage war, and in war, there were no prisoners taken. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. Steve's planning was meticulous, drawing on years of operational experience where failure meant death. He established a war room in his home office, complete with surveillance photos, financial records, and detailed dossiers on both Christy and Perry. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, every weakness identified, every pressure point mapped with surgical precision. The first phase of his plan required patience and careful observation. Steve began documenting Christy's daily routine, noting when she left for work, when she returned, and the growing frequency of her overtime shifts that coincided with Perry's sales calls in the area. He installed hidden cameras throughout their home, not in bedrooms or bathrooms, but in common areas where conversations might reveal useful intelligence. What he discovered was worse than adultery. Christy and Perry weren't just having an affair. They were actively planning to destroy Steve's life together. The recordings captured their late-night phone conversations when Christy thought he was asleep, their discussions about liquidating assets, their mockery of his military service, and their belief that he was too damaged by combat to fight back effectively. "He's just a broken soldier," Christy had laughed during one conversation. "All that tough guy stuff is just compensation for how weak he really is inside. He'll probably just drink himself to death when I leave him." Perry's response had been even more revealing. "The idiot doesn't even know about the medical data operation. Once we get enough money together, we can disappear to Costa Rica and let him deal with the legal fallout. He'll probably end up in federal prison." That conversation had been the final straw. They weren't just betraying him. They were planning to frame him for their crimes while stealing his assets and destroying his reputation. It was a level of malicious planning that elevated their betrayal from personal to professional. Steve's second call was to Jesse O'Connor, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex financial crimes. Jessie was a small, intense woman with the ability to follow money trails that others couldn't even see. She'd helped Steve expose corruption in military contracting overseas, and her work had saved the lives of countless soldiers. "I need you to examine some financial records," Steve told her during their meeting at a downtown coffee shop. "I suspect my wife and her boyfriend are involved in medical data theft and insurance fraud." Jessie's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that made her dangerous to criminals and invaluable to those seeking justice. "How deep do you want me to dig?" "All the way to bedrock. I want to know every dollar they've stolen, every law they've broken, every victim they've created." Within a week, Jessie had uncovered a web of fraud that stretched back 3 years. Perry Fisher wasn't just selling medical data. He was part of a larger operation that involved falsifying insurance claims, manipulating medication prices, and denying coverage to patients with expensive conditions. Christie's patient files have been used to identify and target the most vulnerable victims. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Hundreds of patients have been affected, with many losing their insurance coverage or being forced to pay exorbitant prices for life-saving medications. Several elderly patients had died after being unable to afford their treatments, victims of Perry and Christie's greed. Steve stared at the evidence spread across his desk and felt the cold fury that had once made him feared in combat zones around the world. These weren't just personal betrayals. They were crimes against innocent people, many of whom reminded him of his own aging mother-in-law. The irony was bitter. Christie was caring for her mother while simultaneously destroying other families' elderly relatives. But Martha Singleton's role in the conspiracy was more complex than Steve had initially realized. The old woman wasn't just aware of the affair. She was actively facilitating it. Security footage from the hospital where she received physical therapy showed her meeting regularly with Perry, passing him information about Steve's schedule and activities. Martha had become Christie's co-conspirator, believing that destroying Steve would secure her daughter's future happiness. She'd failed to understand that Perry Fisher was a predator who would discard Christie the moment she became inconvenient or liability. Steve's third ally was Bradley Root, a former NSA analyst who now worked as a private cybersecurity consultant. Bradley could make digital evidence appear or disappear, could trace communications through the darkest corners of the internet, and could create electronic paper trails that would convince any jury. "I need comprehensive digital surveillance," Steve told Bradley during their meeting in the latter's home office. "I want to know every website they visit, every message they send, every financial transaction they make." Bradley's work revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Perry and Christie weren't just planning to flee to Costa Rica. They were planning to fake Perry's death in a car accident, allowing him to collect a substantial life insurance payout while Christie inherited Steve's assets through a carefully orchestrated divorce settlement. The plan was sophisticated and ruthless. Perry would disappear, Christie would play the grieving lover while taking Steve for everything he owned, and they would reunite in South America to live off their combined ill-gotten gains. Steve's reputation would be destroyed, his business ruined, and he would likely face criminal charges for crimes he'd never committed. It was a plan that might have worked against a normal man. But Steve Murray was not normal. He was a predator who'd learned his craft in the world's most dangerous places, and now that predator was focused entirely on destroying those who dared to threaten his family. As he reviewed the complete picture of their betrayal, Steve felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd experienced before major operations overseas, a cold, clear focus that eliminated everything except the mission at hand. Christie and Perry had declared war on him without realizing it. Now, they were about to discover what war with Steve Murray actually looked like. Chapter 5. Gathering the Storm. The next phase of Steve's operation required building a network of allies and assets that could execute his plan with surgical precision. He began by reaching out to old contact from his military contractor days, men and women who understood that sometimes justice required operating outside the conventional boundaries of law and order. Lorenzo Shepard was the first to join his cause. A former Marine Corps reconnaissance specialist, Lorenzo now ran a private investigation firm that specialized in cases the police couldn't or wouldn't touch. He was built like a linebacker, but moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, and his specialty was making people disappear. Not permanently, but long enough for them to understand the consequences of their actions. "You want them destroyed, not just exposed," Lorenzo said after reviewing Steve's intelligence package. It wasn't a question. "Complete destruction," Steve confirmed. "I want them to lose everything they've stolen, everything they've built on lies, and everything they think they deserve." Lorenzo smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. That kind of operation requires careful coordination. "We'll need someone who understands the legal system from the inside." That someone turned out to be Greg Warren, a federal prosecutor who'd grown disgusted with the limitations of working within a system that often protected the wealthy and connected at the expense of their victims. Greg had quietly left the Department of Justice 6 months earlier to start his own practice, specializing in cases that mainstream prosecutors wouldn't touch. "The medical data fraud case is ironclad," Greg told them during a secure meeting at Lorenzo's office. "We have documentation of hundreds of victims, clear evidence of financial gain, and a conspiracy that crosses state lines." Perry Fisher and your wife are looking at federal charges that could put them away for decades. That's not enough, Steve said flatly. Prison is just temporary punishment. I want permanent consequences. Greg raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I want them to experience the same helplessness their victims felt. I want them to lose their health insurance, their financial security, their ability to trust anyone around them. I want them to understand what it feels like to be completely powerless. The plan they developed was comprehensive and ruthless. Phase 1 would involve exposing the medical fraud to federal authorities while simultaneously destroying Perry's pharmaceutical sales network and Christie's nursing career. Phase 2 would target their personal relationships, revealing their true natures to friends, family, and colleagues. Phase 3 would be the most devastating, a coordinated attack on their psychological and emotional well-being that would leave them broken and isolated. But Steve's most important ally was someone much closer to home. Johnny had been watching his parents' marriage deteriorate with the sharp eyes of a child who understood more than adults gave him credit for. At 8 years old, he'd already learned to read the subtle signs of deception, to notice when his mother's smiles didn't reach her eyes, to understand that the tension in the house had nothing to do with his grandmother's condition. "Dad," Johnny said one evening while they worked on a model airplane together, "are you and Mom getting divorced?" Steve looked at his son, seeing intelligence and pain in those young eyes. "What makes you ask that, buddy?" "She talks to someone on the phone when she thinks I'm not listening. She says things about you that aren't nice. And she smells different now, like someone else's cologne." Steve set down his tools and faced his son directly. "Sometimes adults make bad choices, Johnny. Sometimes people we trust decide to hurt us. When that happens, we have to protect ourselves and the people we love. Are you going to protect us?" Johnny asked. "Yes," Steve said simply. "But I need you to help me. Can you do that?" Johnny nodded solemnly. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to watch and listen. If you see or hear anything that doesn't seem right, you tell me immediately. And if I ever tell you to go somewhere or do something, even if it seems strange, you do it without asking questions. Can you promise me that?" "I promise, Dad." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Johnny became Steve's eyes and ears inside the house, reporting on his mother's phone calls, her visitors, and her increasingly erratic behavior. The boy understood that his family was under attack and that his father was the only one strong enough to defend them. Martha Singleton's role in the conspiracy became clearer as Johnny's intelligence gathering improved. The old woman was more than just an enabler. She was actively coordinating with Perry to monitor Steve's movements and activities. She'd been using her physical therapy appointments as opportunities to meet with Perry and pass along information about Steve's business travels, his daily routine, and his relationship with Johnny. "Grandma talks to the bad man, too," Johnny reported one evening. "She tells him we're going to be away for work and when I'll be at school. She thinks you're stupid and that Mom deserves someone better." Steve felt his jaw tighten. Martha's betrayal was perhaps the most bitter of all. He'd welcomed her into his home, cared for her during her illness, and treated her with respect despite her obvious dislike of him. Her reward for his kindness had been to actively participate in destroying his family. But Martha Singleton had made a crucial error in judgment. She'd underestimated the bond between Steve and his son, had assumed that Johnny would remain loyal to his mother and grandmother regardless of their actions. Instead, the boy had chosen to stand with the parent who'd never lied to him, who'd never broken a promise, who'd always treated him with respect and honesty. As the evidence mounted and his plan solidified, Steve began to feel the cold satisfaction that came with having his enemies exactly where he wanted them. Christy, Perry, and Martha all believed they were winning, that their conspiracy was succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. They had no idea that their every move was being monitored, their every communication intercepted, their every weakness cataloged by a man who'd learned warfare in places where mercy was a fatal weakness. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break over their heads with devastating force. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. The funeral of Martha Singleton would be the centerpiece of Steve's revenge, a carefully orchestrated event that would expose every betrayal and destroy every lie his enemies had built their lives upon. But first, Martha actually had to die, and Steve was patient enough to let nature take its course. Martha's second stroke came 3 weeks after Steve had completed his surveillance operation. This one was massive, leaving her completely paralyzed and barely conscious. The doctors gave her days to live, and Christy threw herself into playing the role of the grieving daughter while secretly planning her escape with Perry. Steve used Martha's deteriorating condition as an opportunity to install additional surveillance equipment in the house under the guise of monitoring her health. Every room except the bathrooms now contained hidden cameras and microphones, creating a comprehensive intelligence-gathering network that captured every conversation, every phone call, every intimate moment between Christy and Perry. The recordings from those final weeks were devastating. Christy and Perry discussed their escape plans in Martha's presence, believing the dying woman couldn't understand their words. They talked about the money they'd stolen, the lives they'd destroyed, and their plans to frame Steve for their crimes. Most damning of all, they discussed accelerating Martha's death with an overdose of morphine, making it appear that Steve had killed his mother-in-law in a fit of rage. "The old bitch is taking too long to die," Perry had complained during one of his visits. "We need to move our timeline up before someone starts asking questions about the missing data." "I can give her extra morphine," Christy had replied. "Make it look like Steve lost his temper and overdosed her. Everyone knows he's been under stress, and his military background will make him seem unstable." Steve listened to that conversation with the cold fury of a man who'd seen the absolute worst of human nature. They weren't just planning to murder a helpless old woman. They were planning to destroy his life in the process. The fact that Martha had been complicit in their conspiracy didn't diminish the evil of what they were proposing. But Steve had learned patience in war zones where acting too quickly could get you killed. He documented their murder conspiracy while simultaneously taking steps to ensure that Martha would die naturally before they could implement their plan. He arranged for a different hospice nurse, Melody Swan, to provide round-the-clock care, effectively preventing Christy and Perry from having unsupervised access to the dying woman. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning, her conspiracy dying with her. Christy's performance as the grieving daughter was Academy Award-worthy, complete with tears, dramatic collapses, and heartfelt speeches about her mother's courage and dignity. The funeral arrangements became Steve's masterpiece of psychological warfare. He insisted on a large service, inviting everyone who'd known Martha, her friends from church, her former colleagues from the hospital where she'd worked as a volunteer, her neighbors, and her extended family. Perry would attend, of course, playing the role of the supportive family friend, while secretly celebrating the removal of the final obstacle to his and Christy's escape. But Steve had other plans for Perry Fisher. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. Steve dressed carefully in his dress uniform, complete with his service ribbons and decorations, a subtle reminder to everyone present of exactly who they were dealing with. Christy appeared genuinely surprised by his choice of attire. "Why are you wearing your uniform?" she asked, and Steve noted the hint of nervousness in her voice. "I thought your mother deserved the respect of a military funeral," he replied. "She was family, after all." The first phase of his plan activated when they arrived at the funeral home. Lorenzo Shepard was waiting in the parking lot, dressed as a member of the funeral home staff. His job was simple: ensure that Perry Fisher never made it inside the building. Steve watched through the funeral home's front window as Lorenzo approached Perry's Mercedes in the parking lot. There was a brief conversation, then Perry slumped forward against his steering wheel. Lorenzo had used a fast-acting sedative that would leave Perry unconscious but unharmed, a professional technique that left no trace and caused no permanent damage. Perry's absence didn't go unnoticed, but Christy was too focused on playing her role as the grieving daughter to show more than mild concern. She assumed he'd been delayed by business and would arrive later. The second phase began during the service itself. Steve had arranged for several special guests to attend: federal agents from the FBI's healthcare fraud division, investigators from the state medical board, and victims of Perry and Christie's medical data theft operation. They sat quietly in the back of the room, their presence unknown to Christie but visible to Steve. As the minister delivered his eulogy for Martha, Steve's phone buzzed with a text message from Johnny, who was supposed to be in school. "Dad, don't go to the burial. Come home now. Police cars outside our house." Steve felt a moment of pride at his son's quick thinking and reliable intelligence. Johnny had been watching the house as instructed, ready to provide warning if anything unexpected happened. The presence of police cars meant that Phase 3 of his plan was proceeding on schedule. Steve excused himself from the service, claiming he needed to check on something at home. Christie was too absorbed in accepting condolences from Martha's friends to pay much attention to his departure. As he walked toward his car, Steve felt the same calm focus that had carried him through countless dangerous missions overseas. The trap was springing exactly as planned, and his enemies were about to discover that Steve Murray was not the broken soldier they'd assumed him to be. Chapter 7. The Sun's Warning. The drive home through the Richmond suburbs felt like a march toward destiny. Steve's mind was calm, organized, the way it had been during his most dangerous operations overseas. Every detail of the past months had led to this moment. Every lie cataloged, every betrayal documented, every weakness exploited. His phone rang as he turned onto a street. Johnny's voice was tense, but controlled, displaying the kind of composure that made Steve proud of his son's strength. "Dad, there are 3 police cars in our driveway and an unmarked van across the street. I can see men with suits talking to our neighbors. What should I do?" "Stay exactly where you are," Steve instructed. "Do not answer the door for anyone. I'm 2 minutes away." Steve parked at the end of the block and surveyed the scene. Johnny's intelligence had been accurate. 3 marked police vehicles sat in his driveway, while federal agents conducted interviews with neighbors up and down the street. This was the culmination of months of careful coordination between himself, Greg Warren, and federal law enforcement. Detective Al Powell approached his car as Steve stepped out. Al was a 20-year veteran of the Richmond Police Department who'd worked several cases involving military contractors and understood the complexities of dealing with men like Steve. "Mr. Murray," Al said, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to discuss something important about your mother-in-law." Steve nodded, maintaining the appearance of a concerned son-in-law. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" "We've received allegations that Mrs. Singleton was involved in a medical fraud conspiracy. We also have evidence suggesting that you may have been targeted for identity theft and financial fraud by individuals close to your family." The words were carefully chosen, designed to inform Steve that law enforcement was on his side while maintaining the appearance of a standard investigation. Greg Warren had orchestrated this beautifully, ensuring that Steve would appear to be a victim rather than the architect of his enemy's destruction. "I don't understand," Steve said, playing his part perfectly. "What kind of conspiracy?" Al gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. We have some evidence we'd like you to review." As they walked toward the front door, Steve noticed Johnny watching from an upstairs window. The boy's presence reminded him why he'd undertaken this elaborate campaign of revenge. Not just to punish those who'd betrayed him, but to protect the one person in this mess who'd remained completely innocent. Inside, the house had been transformed into a command center for multiple law enforcement agencies. FBI agents were examining Christie's computer and financial records, while state medical board investigators reviewed patient files that had been recovered from Perry's apartment. The scope of the operation was impressive, a testament to the thoroughness of Steve's planning and Greg Warren's connections within the system. Agent Clarence Nguyen from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division was coordinating the investigation. He was a small, intense man with the kind of attention to detail that made him dangerous to criminals and valuable to prosecutors. "Mr. Murray," Agent Nguyen said, "we need to inform you that your wife and an individual named Perry Fisher are subjects in a federal investigation involving healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. We believe you may have been a victim of their activities." Steve's performance as the shocked husband was flawless. "Christie? That's impossible. She's a nurse. She would never do anything to hurt patients." Agent Nguyen produced a thick folder of evidence. I'm afraid the documentation suggests otherwise. We have evidence that Mrs. Murray has been providing confidential patient information to Mr. Fisher, who has been selling that data to insurance companies. The scheme has affected hundreds of patients and resulted in several deaths due to denied coverage. As Steve reviewed the evidence with apparent shock and growing anger, he marveled at how completely the trap had closed around Christy and Perry. Every piece of evidence had been legally obtained, properly documented, and presented in a way that made their guilt undeniable. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. We also have evidence, Agent Nguyen continued, that your wife and Mr. Fisher have been planning to frame you for their crimes while stealing your assets and fleeing the country. They've been using your mother-in-law as an intermediary to gather intelligence about your activities and schedule. Steve's hands trembled as he processed this information, not from genuine shock, but from the effort required to maintain his performance. Martha was helping them? I'm afraid so. Mrs. Singleton was fully aware of their plans and actively participated in the conspiracy. They were planning to accelerate her death using an overdose of morphine and blame you for her murder. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Even the hardened law enforcement officers present seemed shaken by the scope and viciousness of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. Where's my wife now? Steve asked. Still at the funeral, we believe. We have units standing by to arrest both her and Mr. Fisher as soon as we complete our evidence collection here. Steve pulled out his phone and called Johnny downstairs. When his son appeared, Steve knelt down to meet the boy's eyes directly. Son, do you remember what I told you about sometimes having to protect the people we love? Johnny nodded solemnly. These police officers are here because some people made very bad choices. Mom and Grandma were involved with a bad man who hurt a lot of innocent people. They were planning to hurt us too. Johnny's young face showed understanding beyond his years. Are they going to jail? Yes, Steve said simply. They're going to jail for a very long time. As if on cue, Steve's phone rang. Christie's name appeared on the screen, and Agent Nguyen nodded for him to answer. Steve. Christie's voice was panicked, frantic. Something's happened to Perry. He's in his car in the funeral home parking lot. He's unconscious. And there are people here asking questions about patient files and insurance fraud. I think someone's trying to set us up. Steve met Agent Nguyen's eyes and nodded. The final act was beginning. Christy, Steve said, his voice cold as Arctic wind. I think you need to come home. We need to talk. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Christy arrived home to find her world completely transformed. The police cars, federal agents, and evidence collection teams painted a picture of justice that she hadn't anticipated in her worst nightmares. As she walked through her front door, Christy's face cycled through confusion, fear, and finally a dawning understanding that her carefully constructed lies were crumbling around her. Steve watched from the living room as Agent Nguyen approached Christy with handcuffs and a federal arrest warrant. Her performance as the confused, innocent wife was impressive, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Christine Murray, Agent Nguyen announced formally, "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal patient privacy laws." Christie's eyes found Steve across the room, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. He saw the real her, calculating, manipulative, and completely without remorse. She'd been caught, not because she'd made a mistake, but because she'd underestimated the man she'd betrayed. "Steve," she said, trying one last manipulation, "you have to help me. This is all a mistake. I would never hurt you or Johnny." Steve's response was delivered with the cold precision of a military briefing. "Agent Nguyen, I believe you should know that my wife has been systematically poisoning our son against me while planning to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. She's also been having an affair with Perry Fisher for the past 8 months, using our home for their meetings while my mother-in-law provided intelligence about my schedule." Christie's facade cracked completely. "You bastard. You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting my family," Steve corrected, "from people who threatened our safety and well-being." The arrest proceeded smoothly, with Christie's protests and accusations falling on deaf ears. The evidence was too comprehensive too well documented for her denials to carry any weight. As they led her away, she looked back at Steve one final time. "You'll never prove I knew about the medical data," she spat. "And you'll never get custody of Johnny. I'll make sure you lose everything." Steve's smile was colder than January steel. "Christy, you still don't understand. You've already lost everything." Perry Fisher's arrest had been equally satisfying, though considerably more dramatic. When he'd awakened from Lorenzo's sedative in the funeral home parking lot, he'd found himself surrounded by FBI agents and local police. His attempts to flee had been pathetic, a man in expensive shoes trying to outrun trained law enforcement officers across wet grass. The evidence against Perry was even more damning than what they had on Christy. His apartment had yielded computers full of stolen medical data, financial records showing payments from insurance companies, and detailed plans for his and Christy's escape to Costa Rica. Most devastating of all were the recorded conversations where he discussed accelerating Martha's death and framing Steve for murder. But Steve's revenge extended far beyond simple criminal prosecution. While Christy and Perry sat in federal holding cells awaiting trial, Steve's network of allies began implementing the psychological warfare phase of their destruction. Lorenzo Shepard had spent weeks building detailed profiles of Christy and Perry's friends, family members, and professional contacts. Now he began systematically contacting each person, providing them with carefully selected evidence of their true natures. Christy's nursing colleagues received copies of the stolen patient files. Perry's ex-wives learned about his pattern of targeting married women for financial gain. Their friends and neighbors discovered the depth of their betrayal and the lives they destroyed. The social destruction was swift and complete. Christy's nursing license was permanently revoked by the state medical board. Perry's pharmaceutical sales certifications were canceled by every major drug company. Their professional reputations were utterly destroyed, ensuring that they would never again be able to work in healthcare or any field requiring trust and integrity. But Steve's most devastating weapon was the truth itself. He arranged for the families of patients who died due to denied coverage to learn exactly who was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. 12 families in total, each representing someone who died because Christy and Perry's greed had cost them their insurance coverage. The civil lawsuits began immediately, with each family seeking damages not just for medical expenses, but for wrongful death, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The total liability exceeded $20 million, far more than Christy and Perry could ever hope to pay even if they avoided federal prison. Johnny handled the revelation about his mother with a maturity that both impressed and saddened Steve. The boy had already understood that something was fundamentally wrong with their family dynamic, and the confirmation of his suspicions seemed to bring him relief rather than additional trauma. "Dad," Johnny said one evening as they sat together in Steve's study, "are you sad about Mom?" Steve considered the question carefully. "I'm sad about what she chose to become. The woman I married wouldn't have done these things. But people change, and sometimes they change into someone we don't recognize. Will I see her again? Probably not for a very long time," Steve said honestly. "She's going to be in prison, and even after she gets out, she won't be the same person." Johnny nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Good. She wasn't a good mom anymore. The federal trial proceeded with the swift efficiency that characterized cases with overwhelming evidence. Christy and Perry both attempted to claim innocence, then tried to blame each other, and finally resorted to claiming they'd been manipulated by Steve's superior intelligence and military training. None of their defenses worked. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Christy received 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Perry received 20 years, with additional charges pending from other states where his insurance fraud had affected patients. Steve attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Christy and Perry could see him. He wanted them to understand that their destruction had been personal, deliberate, and complete. When the verdicts were read, he felt no satisfaction, only the cold peace that came with the successful completion of a necessary mission. Chapter 9. The Price of Betrayal. 5 years had passed since the trials, and Steve Murray's life had settled into a rhythm of quiet satisfaction and carefully maintained vigilance. Johnny, now 13, had grown into a sharp, confident young man who understood that strength came from loyalty and that betrayal carried consequences that lasted lifetimes. The house had been completely renovated after Christie's arrest, every room cleansed of her presence and the corruption she'd brought into their lives. Steve had kept only those possessions that held meaning for Johnny: photo albums from before the betrayal, family heirlooms that connected the boy to his heritage, memories from a time when their family had been whole. Christie's letters from federal prison arrived regularly, at first full of rage and accusations, then pleading for forgiveness and a second chance, and finally settling into a desperate acceptance of her situation. Steve read each one carefully before filing them away unread. Johnny had asked to see them once, when he was 12, and after reading 3 of them, had declared that he never wanted to see another. She still doesn't understand what she did wrong. Johnny had observed with the clear moral vision of youth. She thinks she's the victim. Perry Fisher had fared even worse. His attempts to manipulate the prison system had earned him enemies among both guards and inmates. Steve received regular updates on Perry's situation through contacts within the federal prison system. Not because he took pleasure in a man's suffering, but because understanding your enemy's current status was simply good tactical sense. The civil lawsuits had proceeded exactly as Steve had anticipated. Christie and Perry's assets had been seized and distributed among their victims' families, but the monetary damages were secondary to the psychological impact. Both had been forced to confront the human cost of their greed, to face the families of people who died because of their actions. Steve's security consulting business had flourished in the years following the trial. His reputation for thoroughness and absolute reliability had spread throughout the government contracting community, bringing him clients who needed problems solved with precision and discretion. He'd built a team of carefully vetted professionals who shared his values and understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven. Johnny had become his closest confidant and, in many ways, his greatest achievement. The boy possessed his father's analytical mind and his own innate sense of justice. He learned early that the world contained people who would smile while planning your destruction, and that survival required constant vigilance combined with decisive action when threats emerged. "Dad," Johnny said one evening as they worked on a new model airplane, "do you think Mom will ever get out of prison?" "Probably," Steve replied honestly. "She'll serve at least 12 years, but she might get parole after that if she behaves herself." "Will she try to contact us?" Steve set down his tools and looked directly at his son. "She might try, but you need to understand something important, Johnny. The woman in prison isn't the same person who used to be your mother. Prison changes people, and not always for the better. She's been consumed by anger and resentment for 5 years now, blaming everyone except herself for the choices she made. What if she comes back here?" "She won't," Steve said with quiet certainty. "She knows better than that." Johnny nodded, satisfied with this explanation. The boy had developed his father's ability to compartmentalize emotions, to deal with unpleasant realities without being consumed by them. He learned that some people forfeited their right to forgiveness through their actions, and that loyalty was earned rather than assumed. Steve's phone buzzed with a text message from Lorenzo Shepard. "Fisher found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide. Thought you should know." Steve deleted the message and continued working on the model airplane. Perry Fisher's death was neither surprising nor particularly meaningful. The man had been psychologically destroyed years ago, and his physical death was simply the final confirmation of his complete defeat. Christie would learn about Perry's death through the prison grapevine, and it would destroy whatever fragile hope she'd been maintaining about their eventual reunion. She would spend the remaining years of her sentence in the knowledge that her co-conspirator and lover had chosen death over continuing to live with the consequences of their actions. Steve felt no satisfaction at Perry's death, just as he'd felt no satisfaction at their convictions or their civil judgments. Justice wasn't about satisfaction. It was about consequences, about ensuring that actions had appropriate results, about protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their trust. Johnny finished attaching the wing assembly and held up the completed model for inspection. Perfect, Steve said, examining his son's work. Just like everything else you do. I learned from the best, Johnny replied with a grin that reminded Steve of happier times, before betrayal had taught them both hard lessons about human nature. As they cleaned up their workspace, Steve reflected on the path that had brought them to this point. He'd lost a wife and gained a deeper understanding of his son's character. He discovered that even the people closest to you could become enemies. But he'd also learned that some bonds, like the one between a father and son who'd survived betrayal together, were unbreakable. The house was quiet now, peaceful in a way it had never been during Christie's final years. There were no whispered phone calls, no secret meetings, no lies disguised as love. Johnny did his homework at the kitchen table while Steve prepared dinner, both of them comfortable in the silence that came from complete trust. Steve Murray had built his life on the principle that betrayal demanded consequences, that justice sometimes required operating outside conventional boundaries, and that some people forfeited their right to mercy through their actions. He'd taught his son these same principles, not through words, but through example. Christie would serve her time and eventually be released to a world that would never forgive or forget what she'd done. Perry Fisher had chosen his own ending, unable to live with the weight of his crimes and their consequences. Martha Singleton had died, knowing that her granddaughter would learn the truth about her betrayal. And Steve Murray continued forward, scarred but unbroken, protective of the one person who'd remained loyal when loyalty was tested. He'd proven that beneath the civilized surface of suburban life, the old rules still applied. Strength was respected, weakness was exploited, and betrayal was never, ever forgiven. The model airplane sat on the shelf next to dozens of others, each one representing an evening spent building something together, creating memories that would last long after the pain of betrayal had faded. Johnny would grow up understanding that some people could be trusted completely and others couldn't be trusted at all, and that the difference between the two was often a matter of life and death. Steve turned off the lights and locked the house for the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to protect what mattered most. He learned that revenge was best served not hot or cold, but with the calculated precision of a man who understood that justice sometimes required patience, planning, and the absolute conviction that some lines could never be crossed without consequences. In the end, he'd won not because he was stronger or smarter than his enemies, but because he'd understood something they'd never learned, that betrayal was a choice, and choices had consequences that lasted forever. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life Unraveled. Detective Ray Maddox had built his life like a fortress, methodical, impenetrable, and designed to protect what mattered most. At 38, he commanded respect in the Philadelphia Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, where his reputation for never letting a case go cold had earned him both admiration and fear from criminals across the city. His analytical mind, honed by 15 years of police work, could dissect a crime scene like a surgeon, finding patterns others missed. But tonight, staring at his sleeping 9-year-old son Tommy through the tense mesh window, Ray felt something he rarely experienced: peace. The Pocono Mountains stretched endlessly around their campsite, and for the first time in months, work felt like a distant memory. "Dad, you awake?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, buddy. Can't sleep. I keep thinking about Mom." Tommy's words hung in the cool mountain air. When's she coming back from her conference? Ray's jaw tightened slightly. Lisa's marketing conferences had become increasingly frequent over the past 6 months. As a successful real estate agent, she claimed these events were crucial for her career growth. But Ray's investigative instincts had begun to whisper warnings he didn't want to hear. "She'll be back Sunday night," Ray replied, forcing warmth into his voice. "Just you and me until then, soldier." The next morning brought pristine wilderness and the kind of father-son bonding Ray craved. They hiked the mountain trails, Tommy chattering excitedly about everything from rock formations to bird calls. For a few precious hours, Ray forgot about the nagging suspicions that had been eating at him. Lisa Maddox had been the golden girl of Riverside High School, prom queen, valedictorian, and the daughter of successful businessman Robert Sinclair. She'd married Ray when he was still a rookie cop with big dreams and bigger ambitions. For the first 8 years of their marriage, they'd been the perfect couple. Successful careers, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and Tommy, who'd completed their picture-perfect family. But perfection, Ray had learned, was often just an illusion waiting to shatter. The changes had been subtle at first. Lisa started working late more frequently. Her phone always face down during dinner, and she'd become distant in ways that went beyond the normal ebb and flow of a long marriage. When she began taking overnight trips for work, Ray's cop instinct started screaming, but his heart wanted to trust the woman he'd loved for over a decade. "Dad, look!" Tommy's excited voice snapped Ray back to the present. They'd reached a scenic overlook, and the valley spread below them like a green carpet. "It's like we're on top of the world." Ray smiled, watching his son's face light up with wonder. Whatever storms were brewing at home, he'd protect Tommy from them. Some betrayals were unforgivable, but a child's innocence was sacred. That evening, as they roasted marshmallows over their campfire, Tommy grew unusually quiet. Ray noticed the boy glancing toward the tree line with an expression he couldn't read. "Everything okay, champ?" "Dad," Tommy hesitated, poking at the fire with a stick. "Do you think Mom loves us?" The question hit Ray like a physical blow. "Of course she does. Why would you ask that? Sometimes I hear her on the phone at night. She sounds different, happy in a way she doesn't sound with us anymore." Ray felt ice form in his stomach. His 9-year-old son had noticed what Ray had been trying to deny for months. Children, he knew from his police work, often saw truths adults try to hide. "People have different voices for different situations," Ray said carefully. "It doesn't mean anything." But as Tommy nodded and returned to his marshmallow, Ray's mind was already racing. When they returned home, he'd start doing what he should have done months ago, investigating. Because if Lisa was betraying their family, if she was destroying the life they'd built together, there would be consequences. Ray Maddox didn't forgive betrayal. He never had, and he never would. Chapter 2. The morning that changed everything. Ray woke to the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Sunlight filtered through the tense orange fabric, and for a moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sleeping bag beside him was empty. "Tommy," his voice cut through the morning silence. No response. Ray bolted upright, his police training kicking in instantly. Tommy's sleeping bag was cold. He'd been gone for a while. Ray grabbed his jacket and burst from the tent, scanning the campsite. Their fire had died to cold ashes, and there was no sign of his son. "Tommy!" Ray's voice echoed through the forest, panic clawing at his chest. This was every parent's nightmare, made worse by Ray's knowledge of what could happen to children who wandered into the wilderness alone. He forced himself to think like a cop. Tommy was smart and cautious. He wouldn't have wandered far without reason. Ray studied the ground around their campsite until he found what he was looking for. Small footprints leading toward the dense tree line on the eastern side of their camp. The trail was easier to follow than Ray expected. Tommy had walked with purpose, not the meandering path of a lost child. Broken twigs and disturbed leaves marked his passage as clearly as breadcrumbs. But where was he going and why? After 20 minutes of following the trail, Ray heard it, the sound of his son's voice, speaking quietly to someone. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by confusion. Who could Tommy be talking to out here? Ray crept forward, using skills he'd learned in tactical training to move silently through the underbrush. When he finally spotted Tommy, the sight made his blood run cold. His son stood in a small clearing, staring at an old, dilapidated cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The structure leaned precariously to one side, its roof partially collapsed and windows boarded over. Weeds and young trees grew through gaps in the foundation, and the whole building looked ready to collapse at any moment. But it was Tommy's posture that sent alarm bells ringing in Ray's head. His son stood perfectly still, as if he'd been there many times before, as if this place held some terrible familiarity. "What are you doing?" Ray yelled, bursting from the tree line. Tommy spun around, his eyes wide with what looked like fear, but not fear of being caught. Fear of something else entirely. "Daddy." Tommy's voice was small and strange. "This is where Mommy bring me when you away on business trips." The words hit Ray like a sledgehammer. He stared at his son, then at the cabin, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Lisa had been bringing Tommy here? To this place that looked like it belonged in a horror movie? "What do you mean, buddy?" Ray kept his voice level, though every instinct screamed at him to grab his son and run. "She said it was our special secret place," Tommy whispered. "She said I could never tell you because it would make you sad." Ray's vision blurred with rage. Lisa had been manipulating their son, using him to keep secrets, bringing him to this godforsaken place for reasons Ray was only beginning to imagine. He approached the cabin slowly, Tommy trailing behind him. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, and Ray could see inside through the gaps. What he saw there made him understand why his son looked so frightened. The interior had been cleaned and furnished. Not recently, but recently enough. There was a sleeping bag in one corner, some basic camping supplies, and scattered around the main room were items that made Ray's blood boil. Women's clothing, men's clothing, empty wine bottles, and photographs. Photographs of Lisa with a man Ray didn't recognize. Photographs of them together in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. And worse, photographs that showed Tommy in the background of some shots, playing alone outside while the adults were inside. Ray pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. "This is Detective Ray Maddox, badge number 47821, he said when the dispatcher answered. "I need to report a crime scene at the following coordinates." As he provided the location details, his mind was already working through the implications. Lisa hadn't just been cheating on him. She'd been using their son as cover, bringing him to witness her betrayal, making him complicit in the destruction of their family. Some betrayals were unforgivable. This was beyond forgiveness. This was war. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of uniformed officers, crime scene technicians, and evidence collection. Ray's colleagues from the Major Crimes Unit arrived within 40 minutes, led by his partner, Detective Angela Torres, a sharp-eyed woman who'd worked with Ray for 5 years and knew him well enough to recognize the controlled fury burning behind his professional demeanor. "Ray, you need to step back from this," Angela said quietly as they watched the text photograph the cabin's interior. "Let us handle it." "Like hell I will." Ray's voice was granite. "This is my family they've destroyed." Inside the cabin, the evidence told a story that made Ray's stomach churn. The crime scene photographers documented everything. The makeshift bedroom, the wine bottles with 2 sets of fingerprints, the photographs scattered across a makeshift table, and most damning of all, a journal hidden beneath the floorboards. Ray recognized Lisa's handwriting immediately. The entries dated back 8 months, documenting her affair with someone named Cole Brandenburg. But as Ray read over the crime scene text's shoulder, he realized this was far more complex than a simple adultery case. "She's been planning this," Ray muttered, reading entry after entry detailing Lisa's growing resentment of their marriage, her calculations about divorce settlements, and her strategizing about how to gain maximum custody of Tommy while minimizing Ray's parental rights. Angela peered at the journal. "Look at this entry from 3 months ago." Ray read aloud. "Cole says if we can prove Ray is unstable, we could get full custody. He thinks Ray's job makes him a risk to Tommy. We just need the right evidence." The implications hit Ray like a freight train. Lisa and her lover hadn't just been conducting an affair. They'd been systematically planning to destroy his relationship with his son. Every late night, every suspicious phone call, every conference had been part of a calculated campaign to reshape their lives according to their desires. "Who's Cole Brandenburg?" Angela asked, pulling out her phone to run the name through police databases. "Never heard of him," Ray replied, but his mind was already cataloging every detail of this place, every piece of evidence, every angle of their betrayal. His years as a detective had taught him that revenge was a dish best served with meticulous planning. Tommy sat in the back of a police cruiser, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot chocolate from a thermos one of the officers had provided. Ray's heart broke seeing his son's confusion and fear, but it also fueled his determination. Whatever Lisa and her lover had planned, whatever game they thought they were playing, they'd made one critical error. They'd involve his child. Angela returned from her phone call with information that made Ray's blood run cold. Cole Brandenburg, 34, divorced, works as a personal trainer at an upscale gym in Chestnut Hill. No criminal record, but here's the interesting part. He filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago and has been living in a rental property owned by, guess who? Lisa's father. Ray finished grimly. Robert Sinclair had always disapproved of Ray's blue-collar background, despite his success in law enforcement. If he was helping finance his daughter's affair, it meant this betrayal ran deeper than just Lisa's individual choices. The crime scene team finished their work by early afternoon, and Ray was finally allowed to take Tommy home. During the drive down the mountain, his son was unusually quiet, staring out the window with an expression that seemed far too mature for his 9 years. "Dad," Tommy's voice was small. "Am I in trouble for not telling you about the cabin?" Ray pulled over at a scenic overlook and turned to face his son. "Tommy, listen to me very carefully. You're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Sometimes adults make very bad choices, and they try to make children keep secrets about those choices. But you're not responsible for what the adults did. Is Mom going to go to jail?" The question hung in the air between them. Ray could see in his son's eyes a heartbreaking mixture of fear, confusion, and something that looked like relief. How long had Tommy been carrying the weight of these secrets? "I don't know yet," Ray answered honestly. "But I promise you this, whatever happens, I will protect you. No one will ever use you to hurt our family again." As they continued the drive home, Ray's mind was already formulating plans. Lisa and Cole thought they were playing a game where they held all the cards. They thought they could manipulate his son, destroy his marriage, and walk away with everything they wanted. They were about to learn what happened when someone tried to outmaneuver a man who'd spent 15 years studying the criminal mind. Ray Maddox had never lost a case he'd chosen to pursue personally. He didn't plan to start now. This was just the beginning. Chapter 4, The Enemy Revealed. Ray's house felt like a crime scene when they returned Sunday evening. Every familiar object, family photos, Lisa's coffee mug still in the sink, Tommy's art projects on the refrigerator, seemed tainted by the knowledge of what had been happening behind his back. He moved through the rooms like a stranger, seeing his own life through the lens of betrayal. Tommy went to bed early, emotionally exhausted from the weekend's revelations. As Ray tucked him in, his son grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Dad, will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course, buddy." Ray sat in the chair beside Tommy's bed, watching his son's face relax into sleep. But his mind was racing, planning, calculating. He'd spent the afternoon making phone calls to contacts throughout the city, private investigators, fellow cops, people who owed him favors from past cases. By the time Lisa returned from her conference, Ray would know everything there was to know about Cole Brandenburg and the web of deception they'd woven around his family. Lisa's key turned in the front door at exactly 9:47 p.m. Ray had been timing her arrivals for months without realizing it. Another unconscious investigative habit. She entered with the false brightness of someone carrying a guilty conscience, dropping her overnight bag by the door with practiced casualness. "How was the camping trip?" she called out, hanging her coat in the closet. Ray emerged from the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, their old evening ritual from happier times. He offered her one with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Eventful," he said simply. Lisa accepted the coffee, and Ray studied her face as she took her first sip. Even knowing what he knew, she was still beautiful, the same woman he'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. But now he could see the subtle signs he'd been missing. The way she avoided direct eye contact, the slight tremor in her hands, the practiced nature of her casual demeanor. "Tommy have fun?" she asked. "He learned some interesting things about family secrets," Ray replied, watching her reaction carefully. A micro-expression flickered across Lisa's face. Fear, quickly suppressed. Oh, what kind of secrets? The kind that involve abandoned cabins in the woods. The coffee mug slipped from Lisa's hands, shattering on the hardwood floor. Coffee splashed across her shoes and the floor, but she stood frozen, staring at Ray with eyes that had gone wide with panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. Ray pulled out his phone and showed her the first photograph the crime scene team had taken. The interior of the cabin with its makeshift bedroom and scattered evidence of two lovers' meetings. "Cole Brandenburg," Ray said quietly. 34 years old, personal trainer, bankrupt, living in property owned by your father. "Should I continue?" Lisa's face crumpled, and for a moment, Ray saw the woman he'd once loved fighting with the stranger she'd become. But only for a moment. "How dare you spy on me?" she hissed, her fear transforming instantly into anger. "How dare you follow me and invade my privacy?" The audacity of her response hit Ray like a physical blow. Even caught red-handed, even knowing she'd been using their son as cover for her betrayal, she was trying to make him the villain. "I didn't follow you," Ray said with deadly calm. "Our son led me to your secret place. The same son you've been dragging into your affair for months, making him keep secrets, using him as your alibi while you destroyed our family. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." Ray's voice cut through her protests like a blade. "I've read your journal, Lisa. I know about your plans to frame me as an unfit father. I know about Cole's bankruptcy and your father's involvement. I know everything." Lisa's mask finally slipped completely. The woman standing in his living room bore little resemblance to the person he'd married. Her eyes held a coldness he'd never seen before, a calculating cruelty that made him wonder how long she'd been pretending to be someone else. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," she said softly. "This isn't just about an affair, Ray. This is about rebuilding my life without the anchor of a husband who'll never be more than a small-town cop with small-town dreams. And our son? What was he in your grand plans? Tommy deserves better than growing up watching his mother settle for mediocrity." Ray felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This wasn't the heat of passion or temporary insanity. This was calculated betrayal, planned over months, with his child used as a weapon against him. "Get out," he said quietly. "This is my house, too. Get out now, or I'll arrest you for child endangerment and conspiracy." The evidence team found enough in that cabin to support both charges. Lisa stared at him for a long moment, and Ray could see her mind working, calculating, trying to find an angle she could use. But 15 years of police work had taught him to recognize when someone realized they were trapped. "This isn't over," she said, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. "No," Ray agreed. "It's just beginning." After she left, Ray stood in his living room, surrounded by the shattered remnants of what he'd thought was his life. But instead of despair, he felt something else, a cold, clean fury that his years in law enforcement had taught him to channel into action. Lisa and Cole had declared war on his family. They'd used his son as a weapon and planned to destroy his relationship with the person who mattered most to him in the world. They were about to discover that Ray Maddox wasn't just a small-town cop. He was a man who'd spent his career learning how to dismantle criminal enterprises, and he'd never met a puzzle he couldn't solve or an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver. The game was on. Chapter 5, Allies and Assets. Monday morning brought Ray's first day off in 3 months, a sick leave he'd arranged with his captain under the guise of dealing with a family emergency. It wasn't technically a lie. This was definitely an emergency, just not the kind his department would expect him to handle through official channels. He dropped Tommy at school with instructions to call him immediately if anyone other than Ray tried to pick him up. His son's quiet, "Okay, Dad," and tight hug told Ray that Tommy understood more about their situation than a 9-year-old should have to. Ray's first stop was downtown Philadelphia, to the office of Marcus Webb, a private investigator who'd worked with the police department on several high-profile cases. Webb was expensive, discreet, and had a reputation for finding information that others couldn't, or wouldn't, uncover. "Ray Maddox," Webb said, rising from behind his desk with a knowing smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Word travels fast in our business. What have you heard? That you've got personal problems that are about to become very public problems. Webb gestured to a chair across from his desk. I also heard you might need the kind of help that stays off official records. Ray had worked with Webb on a corruption case 2 years earlier and had been impressed by the man's thoroughness and absolute discretion. If anyone could help him build an airtight case against Lisa and Cole, it was Webb. I need everything, Ray said, sliding a photograph of Cole Brandenburg across the desk. Financial records, employment history, criminal background, personal relationships, medical records if you can get them legally. Everything that explains how a bankrupt personal trainer ended up orchestrating the destruction of a cop's family. Webb studied the photograph. Cole Brandenburg. I actually know this guy's story. He was married to money once, rich wife, fancy house in the suburbs, the whole package. Then she caught him cheating, and her daddy's lawyers ate him alive in the divorce. Lost everything, including custody of his kid. He has a child? Had. His ex-wife remarried some tech millionaire and moved to California. Brandenburg hasn't seen his daughter in over a year. Webb leaned back in his chair. Guy like that, losing his meal ticket and his kid, that creates a special kind of desperation. Ray felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Cole wasn't just Lisa's lover. He was someone who'd already lost a family and was trying to build a new one using pieces stolen from Ray's life. There's something else, Webb continued. Brandenburg's been seen around town with people who have interesting reputations. Not criminals exactly, but the kind of people who know how to make problems disappear for the right price. What kind of problems? The kind that involve custody battles, character assassination, evidence that might mysteriously disappear from police files. Webb's expression was grim. Ray, I think your wife and her boyfriend aren't just planning to steal your kid. I think they're planning to frame you for something that'll make sure you never see him again. Ray's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? Webb pulled out a thick file and spread several photographs across his desk. They showed Cole at various locations around the city, meeting with people Ray recognized from his years in law enforcement. Not criminals, but the gray area operators who worked just inside the law's boundaries. This guy here, Webb pointed to a photograph showing Cole shaking hands with a thin, nervous-looking man outside a coffee shop, is Danny Torres. He specializes in creating false evidence for divorce cases. This woman, he indicated another photo, is Sarah Chun, former cop turned private security. She's been known to help people disappear evidence when the price is right. They're building a case against me, Ray realized. More than that, based on what I'm seeing, they're planning to plant evidence that'll make you look like a dirty cop. Maybe drug money, maybe stolen evidence, maybe both. Something that'll not only cost you custody, but put you in prison. Ray stared at the photographs, his mind racing through the implications. Lisa and Cole weren't just trying to steal his family. They were trying to destroy his life completely, ensuring he'd never be able to fight back. But they made a critical error. They were playing games with a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to think like a criminal, who had resources they couldn't imagine, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose except his son. I need something else, Ray said, pulling out his wallet. I need you to find everything you can about Robert Sinclair's business dealings. Lisa's father is financing this operation, and I want to know why. Webb's eyes lit up with interest. The real estate mogul? Now that's interesting. Sinclair's been skating on thin ice for years. City contracts that smell like insider trading, development deals that violate zoning laws, the kind of wealth that comes from knowing which palms to grease. You think he's dirty? I think he's the kind of man who'd do anything to protect his reputation and his money. If his daughter's marriage to a cop is creating problems for his business interests, he might be willing to invest heavily in making those problems disappear. Ray stood up, his mind already formulating the next phase of his plan. Lisa and Cole thought they were playing chess, but they just revealed they were actually playing against someone who'd learned the game from the criminals he'd spent his career catching. How long do you need? Ray asked. Give me a week. Maybe less if you're willing to pay for expedited service. Money's no object. But Webb, this has to be absolutely clean. Whatever we find, whatever we do with it, it has to be legally bulletproof. I'm not just fighting for my marriage anymore. I'm fighting for my son. Webb nodded grimly. Understood. And Ray, watch your back. People like Brandenburg and Sinclair don't just destroy lives, they eliminate obstacles. You've already proven you're not going to roll over and disappear. That makes you dangerous to them. As Ray left Webb's office, he felt the familiar cold clarity that came when a difficult case finally started making sense. Lisa and Cole had started this war thinking they were facing a heartbroken husband. Instead, they'd awakened something far more dangerous. A detective with unlimited motivation and 15 years of experience hunting people who thought they were smarter than the law. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. Chapter 6. The Trap Takes Shape. By Friday, Ray's world had been transformed into a battleground where every conversation was recorded, every meeting was surveilled, and every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged for the war he knew was coming. Webb's investigation had revealed depths of betrayal that even Ray's cynical cop instincts hadn't anticipated. The first blow came from an unexpected source. Tommy's school counselor, Mrs. Anderson, called Ray at work with concerns about his son's emotional state and home environment. When Ray arrived at the school that afternoon, he discovered that someone had been feeding the counselor carefully crafted lies about his increasingly erratic behavior and concerning statements about violence that Tommy had allegedly made. Mr. Maddox, Mrs. Anderson said carefully, Tommy mentioned that you've been very angry lately, that you've been talking about making people pay for hurting your family. We're concerned about the home environment. Ray felt his jaw clench. Lisa and Cole were already moving, using his own son's innocent words to build their case against him. But Ray had been expecting this. Webb's investigation had revealed that character assassination through a child's school records was one of Cole's girlfriend's specialties. Mrs. Anderson, I appreciate your concern, Ray said calmly, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about the context of Tommy's comments. My wife and I are going through some marital difficulties, and I've been explaining to Tommy that sometimes adults have to face consequences for their choices. Perhaps that's what he was referring to. What Ray didn't mention was that he'd been recording every conversation with Tommy for the past week, ensuring he had evidence of exactly what had been said and in what context. Lisa and Cole could play games with his words, but they couldn't change digital recordings. The second blow came that evening, when Ray discovered that someone had been through his house while he was at work. Nothing was missing, but small items had been moved, just enough to let him know that his home had been violated. His service weapon, locked in a department-approved gun safe, showed signs that someone had attempted to access it. Ray's phone rang as he was documenting the break-in. Webb's voice was tight with urgency. Ray, we've got problems. I've been monitoring Brandenburg and your wife, and they're moving faster than expected. Tomorrow night, they're meeting with someone who specializes in planting evidence in police officers' homes. What kind of evidence? The kind that would suggest you're dealing drugs on the side. Enough to trigger an internal affairs investigation and immediate suspension. Combined with the school's concerns about Tommy's welfare, it would be enough to get emergency custody transferred to your wife. Ray felt the walls closing in, but instead of panic, he felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter whose prey had finally revealed itself completely. Where's the meeting? Brandenburg's apartment, 8 p.m. tomorrow. But Ray, you can't just bust in there. They're being careful, keeping everything legal enough that even if they get caught, the damage to your reputation would already be done. I'm not planning to bust in anywhere, Ray said quietly. I'm planning something much better. The next 24 hours were a carefully choreographed dance of surveillance, counter-surveillance, and strategic positioning. Ray called in favors from every contact he'd made in 15 years of police work, assembling a network of observers and evidence gatherers that would make the FBI proud. At 7:45 p.m. on Saturday, Ray sat in an unmarked surveillance van 3 blocks from Cole Brandenburg's apartment, surrounded by recording equipment and 3 off-duty cops who'd volunteered their time after learning what Lisa and Cole were planning to do to his family. Target 1 approaching the building. Officer Maria Santos reported from her position across the street. Lisa Maddox, carrying what appears to be evidence bags. Target 2 already inside, added Detective Bilchon from his post in the building's parking garage. Brandenburg's been preparing for this meeting all day. At exactly 8 p.m., a third figure appeared, Danny Torres, the evidence-planting specialist Webb had identified. Ray watched through high-powered binoculars as the man entered Brandenburg's building carrying a briefcase that likely contained enough planted evidence to destroy Ray's career. But Ray wasn't planning to stop them. He was planning to let them complete their crime while documenting every second of it. "All units, maintain positions," Ray said into his radio. "Let them finish what they came to do." For the next 90 minutes, Ray's team recorded everything. Lisa's arrival, the meeting between all three conspirators, and most importantly, Torres leaving with empty hands while Brandenburg and Lisa left with packages that clearly contained the planted evidence they planned to place in Ray's home. As the conspirators went their separate ways, Ray felt the cold satisfaction of a plan coming together perfectly. They thought they were about to destroy him, but instead, they just provided him with ironclad evidence of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and attempted frame-up of a police officer. "Phase 1 complete," Ray said into his radio. "Now we see how far they're really willing to go." But even as his team began following the conspirators to their next moves, Ray's mind was already working on Phase 2. Because stopping Lisa and Cole from framing him was only the beginning of what he had planned for them. They tried to steal his son and destroy his life. Now they were going to learn what happened when someone tried to outmaneuver a man who'd spent his career taking down people who thought they were untouchable. The real trap was just beginning to close. Chapter 7. The Web Titans. Sunday morning brought the sound of sirens to Ray's neighborhood. At exactly 6:47 a.m., 3 patrol cars pulled into his driveway, their lights flashing as uniformed officers approached his front door with what appeared to be a search warrant. Ray answered the door in his bathrobe, playing the role of confused and innocent husband perfectly. He'd been expecting this visit. His surveillance team had tracked Lisa and Cole as they planted evidence in his garage the night before, and he'd watched them make the anonymous tip to internal affairs that would trigger this search. "Detective Maddox," Sergeant Williams said formally, "we have a warrant to search these premises for suspected narcotics and related paraphernalia." "Of course," Ray replied, stepping aside. "I'm not sure what this is about, but please search wherever you need to." What the search team found was exactly what Lisa and Cole had planted. 2 bags of cocaine hidden in Ray's toolbox, along with a substantial amount of cash wrapped in evidence bags from the police department. To any observer, it looked like a police detective had been stealing drugs from crime scenes and selling them on the side. But what the search team also found, hidden in places Lisa and Cole didn't know about, were the high-definition cameras Ray had installed throughout his property. Cameras that had recorded every moment of the break-in, every second of evidence being planted, and every face of the people involved in framing him. "This is very serious," Detective Sergeant Williams said as the evidence was bagged and tagged. "You'll need to surrender your weapon and badge pending the internal affairs investigation." Ray complied with appropriate confusion and concern, even as his phone buzzed with a text from Webb. "Package delivered. Opening tomorrow." The package was a complete dossier on Cole Brandenburg, Robert Sinclair, and their network of associates, along with every piece of evidence Webb had gathered about their conspiracy. Tomorrow, copies would be delivered simultaneously to the district attorney's office, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and the Philadelphia Inquirer's investigative reporting team. But Ray's most important stop was Tommy's school, where he arrived to find his son already packed and ready to leave with Lisa, who'd apparently gained emergency custody based on the morning's drug bust. "I'm sorry, Mr. Maddox," the principal said uncomfortably, "but given the circumstances, we have to follow the court order." Ray knelt down to Tommy's level, his heart breaking at the confusion and fear in his son's eyes. "Tommy, I need you to remember what we talked about. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what you hear, I love you, and I'm going to fix this." "Okay." Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Are you really a bad guy, Dad?" "No, buddy, I'm not. And very soon, everyone will know the truth." As Ray watched Lisa drive away with his son, he felt the last vestiges of mercy leave his heart. They'd crossed the final line by using Tommy as a weapon against him. What happened next wouldn't just be about clearing his name. It would be about ensuring that Lisa and Cole never had the chance to hurt another family the way they'd hurt his. Monday morning brought chaos to Lisa's carefully constructed world. Webb's dossier had been delivered to every relevant authority, and the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing payments from Robert Sinclair to the evidence planning specialist, photographs of secret meetings, recorded conversations discussing the frame-up, and most damning of all, security footage showing Lisa and Cole planting drugs in Ray's garage. By noon, Cole Brandenburg was in federal custody on charges of conspiracy to commit evidence tampering and attempted framing of a police officer. By evening, Lisa had been arrested as well, and Robert Sinclair was facing his own federal investigation for corruption and conspiracy. But Ray's masterstroke came when Webb revealed the depth of his investigation into Cole's background. The man wasn't just a failed personal trainer. He was a serial predator who'd use his access to wealthy women to systematically destroy their marriages and steal their assets. Lisa wasn't his first victim. She was his latest in a string of carefully targeted divorces that had netted him and his associates hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 3 years. Your wife thought she was the mastermind, Webb explained as they sat in Ray's living room, Tommy finally home and asleep upstairs. But she was just another mark. Brandenburg and his crew specialize in identifying unhappy wives with wealthy husbands, seducing them, and then helping them destroy their marriages in ways that maximize the financial settlement. Ray stared at the photographs Webb spread across his coffee table. Images of Cole with at least 6 other women over the past 5 years, all wealthy, all divorced under suspicious circumstances, all of whom had lost substantial assets to men who disappeared shortly after their divorces were finalized. Lisa wasn't having an affair, Ray realized. She was being conned by professionals. And when you started getting close to the truth, they decided to eliminate the threat by framing you and taking your kid. But they made one critical error. They assumed you'd react like a victim instead of like a cop. The final piece of Ray's revenge came when he realized that Lisa's betrayal had been built on lies from the beginning. She hadn't chosen to destroy their family. She'd been manipulated into it by criminals who saw her as nothing more than another source of income. But that didn't change what she'd done to Tommy. It didn't change the months of lies, the manipulation of their son, or the willingness to destroy an innocent child's relationship with his father for money. Some betrayals were too deep for forgiveness, even when they were built on deception. Chapter 8. Justice Served Cold. 6 months later, Ray stood in a federal courtroom watching Cole Brandenburg receive a 15-year sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The investigation Webb had initiated had unraveled an entire network of marriage-for-profit schemes that had destroyed dozens of families across 3 states. Lisa sat in the defendant's chair beside him, no longer the confident woman who'd tried to steal his life. The months of investigation had revealed her true role in the conspiracy. Not the mastermind she believed herself to be, but another victim who'd allowed herself to become a willing participant in her own family's destruction. The court recognizes that Mrs. Maddox may have been initially deceived by Mr. Brandenburg's criminal enterprise, Judge Patricia Hoffman said during sentencing. However, her continued participation in activities designed to frame her husband and manipulate her own child demonstrates a level of calculated cruelty that cannot be overlooked. Lisa received 5 years for her role in the conspiracy, with the possibility of parole in 3 if she testified against other members of Brandenburg's network. Ray felt no satisfaction watching her break down as the sentence was read, only a cold sense of justice being served. Robert Sinclair's involvement had cost him everything. The federal investigation into his business dealings had revealed decades of corruption, bribery, and money laundering. His real estate empire collapsed. His political connections evaporated, and he faced 20 years in federal prison. The man who'd thought he could buy his daughter's way out of an inconvenient marriage had lost everything trying to destroy a cop who'd refused to be intimidated. But Ray's most important victory was the one that happened outside the courtroom. Tommy, after months of therapy and careful reconstruction of his understanding of what had happened, was beginning to heal from the trauma of being used as a weapon against his own father. "Dad," Tommy said as they walked out of the courthouse together, "are you glad Mom's going to jail?" Ray considered the question carefully. I'm glad that the people who hurt our family are being held responsible for what they did. I'm sad that your mom made choices that led her to this place. But mostly, I'm grateful that you're safe and that we can start building our life together again." Tommy nodded with the serious expression of a child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. Will she ever come home? Maybe someday, when she served her time and learned from her mistakes. But that's years away, and by then, you'll be old enough to decide for yourself what kind of relationship you want to have with her. As they drove home from the courthouse, Ray reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had ultimately led to the dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families for years. His reputation as a detective had been not only restored but enhanced. The federal prosecutors were already talking about offering him a position with their public corruption unit. But more importantly, he and Tommy were free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, and the toxic influence of people who'd been willing to sacrifice a child's well-being for their own selfish goals. That evening, as Ray tucked Tommy into bed, his son asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Dad, do you think you'll ever get married again?" Ray smiled, thinking of Detective Angela Torres, who'd been increasingly present in their lives as both a colleague and something more. "Maybe someday, buddy. But only to someone who understands that you and I are a package deal, and that family loyalty isn't negotiable." "Good," Tommy said firmly, "because I like how things are now. Just us, but better. Just us, but better." Ray couldn't have summarized their new life more perfectly. They'd lost a wife and mother who'd proven herself unworthy of their trust, but they'd gained something more valuable, an unbreakable bond forged in the fire of betrayal and strengthened by their refusal to let anyone destroy what truly mattered. Some men might have chosen forgiveness. Some men might have tried to rebuild what had been broken. But Ray Maddox wasn't some man. He was a man who understood that some betrayals were so fundamental, so cruel in their targeting of innocence, that they demanded not forgiveness but justice. And justice, Ray had learned, was sometimes the most powerful form of love. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 2 years after the camping trip that changed everything, Ray stood in the backyard of their new house, watching Tommy practice batting with the confidence of a boy who'd learned he could trust the adults in his life to protect him. The house was smaller than their old one, but it was theirs, free from the memories of betrayal and filled with the promise of honest new beginnings. Angela Torres emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the comfortable smile of someone who'd found her place in their unconventional family. She and Ray had married 6 months earlier in a simple ceremony with Tommy as the best man and no guests who hadn't proven their loyalty through fire. "The lawyer called," Angela said, handing Ray his coffee. "Lisa's parole hearing is next month." Ray nodded. He'd known this day would come eventually. Lisa had served 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence, and her cooperation with federal prosecutors had earned her consideration for early release. The woman who tried to destroy his family would soon be free to try to rebuild some version of her own life. "What did you tell him?" Angela asked. "That we'll attend the hearing, but we won't oppose her release. She's paid her debt to society, and Tommy deserves the chance to decide for himself what kind of relationship he wants with his mother." Tommy jogged over, sweat beading on his forehead, but grinning with the satisfaction of finally mastering a swing that had been giving him trouble for weeks. "Did you see that one, Dad? Perfect contact." "I saw it, champ. Getting ready for tryouts next week. Angela's been helping me with my stance. She says I need to keep my eye on the ball longer." Ray watched his son include Angela naturally in the conversation and felt the deep satisfaction of a family that had been rebuilt on honesty instead of convenient lies. Angela had never tried to replace Tommy's mother. Instead, she'd simply proven herself worthy of trust through consistency, honesty, and an absolute commitment to protecting the family they'd all chosen to create together. That evening, after Tommy went to bed, Ray and Angela sat on their porch, watching the sun set over their neighborhood of modest houses filled with families who'd built their lives on foundation of hard work and genuine affection. "Are you worried about Lisa getting out?" Angela asked. Ray considered the question seriously. "I'm cautious. People don't always learn from their mistakes, and she still has a talent for manipulation. But Tommy's older now, stronger. He understands what really happened, and he's built a life that doesn't depend on her approval or presence. And you, Ray smiled, thinking of the man he'd been before the betrayal. Trusting, perhaps naive, certainly unprepared for the level of calculated cruelty his wife had been capable of. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder, but also more honest about the realities of human nature. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said simply. The next week brought Tommy's baseball tryouts and Ray's promotion to lieutenant in the Major Crimes Unit. Both achievements felt earned rather than given, the result of hard work and perseverance through adversity. Tommy made the team as starting shortstop, and Ray's new position came with both increased responsibility and the chance to mentor younger detectives who were still learning that justice wasn't always served in courtrooms. Cole Brandenburg died in federal prison 3 months before Lisa's release, the victim of violence from other inmates who didn't appreciate men who preyed on families. Ray felt no satisfaction at the news, only a recognition that some people created so much destruction that the world eventually destroyed them in return. Robert Sinclair lived, but in circumstances that would have horrified the man who'd once thought he could buy his way out of any problem. Penniless, friendless, and facing another decade in prison, he'd written Tommy a letter attempting to apologize for his role in destroying the boy's family. Ray had read the letter carefully before deciding that some apologies were too little, too late, and too self-serving to deserve a response. Tommy never even knew his grandfather had tried to reach out. Some protections were permanent. On the day of Lisa's release, Ray and Tommy drove to the prison to pick her up, not as a reunion, but as a civilized conclusion to a chapter that had defined their lives for too long. Lisa emerged from the prison looking older, smaller, and genuinely broken by the consequences of her choices. The conversation during the drive to the halfway house where she'd be living was awkward but necessary. Tommy, now 12 and more perceptive than many adults, asked direct questions about why she'd made the choices she had, whether she understood how those choices had affected him, and what she planned to do differently. Lisa's answers were a mixture of genuine remorse and self-justification that left Ray convinced she still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she'd done. But Tommy seemed satisfied that he'd been heard, and that was what mattered. "Will I see you again?" Tommy asked as they dropped her off at the halfway house. "If you want to," Lisa replied, "but only when you want to, and only in ways that feel safe for you." It was, Ray reflected, perhaps the most honest thing she'd said to their son in years. As they drove home, Tommy was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I'm glad we went, but I'm also glad we're going home to Angela." "Me too, buddy. Me too." That night, as Ray tucked Tommy into bed, his son asked one final question about the ordeal that had shaped their lives. "Dad, do you ever regret not forgiving Mom?" Ray considered his answer carefully. "Tommy, forgiveness is something you give when someone has truly accepted responsibility for their actions, and when continuing to be angry hurts you more than it helps. Your mother chose to betray our family in ways that put you in danger and try to steal your relationship with me. Some betrayals are so fundamental that forgiveness isn't the right response. Justice is. But she's my mom. She is. And if someday she proves that she's truly changed, that she understands what she did wrong, and has become someone trustworthy, then you can decide what kind of relationship you want with her. But you never have to forgive someone just because they're family. Family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty, protection, and love that doesn't come with conditions." Tommy nodded, processing this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always trustworthy just because they were supposed to be. "I love our family," he said simply. "So do I, champ. So do I." As Ray turned off the lights and headed downstairs, he found Angela waiting for him with a glass of wine and a smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "How was he?" she asked. "Strong, wise, ready to move forward. Like his father." Ray pulled her close, thinking of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had